It's my pleasure now to take it one step further to talk a little bit about the CUSP roadmap and how the AURORA results actually link to the CUSP roadmap. I have it here. This is the CUSP Research Roadmap, which was actually collectively written by the different CUSP projects as a gift to the European Committee and the scientific audience to see really what the priorities are between 2026 and 2032 regarding micro nanoplastic research. We identified 5 areas where we thought that we really need to focus on when we want to move this field forward. The first one, and we have heard a lot about this already, was basically what do we need to do on the analytical methods and representative materials. In the CUSP roadmap, which you can find on the CUSP website, but also on the AURORA website, and I have some hard copies here. If you want to take those back on the plane or train after the meeting, then please visit me. We defined basically immediate goals, which were 0 to 2 years from now that we actually need to deal with now before we actually can move this field forward. We identified midterm priorities, which were between 2 or 5 years that actually would follow that first set, and then things that we said were important, but probably more on the long term after 5 years that we actually need to prioritize. What you can see in this slide basically here on your left side are these goals from the CUSP roadmap, which really echo what has been said, that we need these quality assurance for the analytical methods, that we need reference materials to be used. From that, basically, we can then go and improve the methods by getting more sensitive. And at a certain moment, when we actually feel comfortable that we can move it forward, we actually then have to think about the throughput of these methods. As you have seen from the discussion of Juliette, the throughput now for actually doing all these tier systems is not that we actually can deal with the complete complexity. So we have to think basically at a certain moment how we actually can do that. What AURORA has added to this is, I think, a lot of the immediate goals is where we have made a difference now. That is that we do have the quality assurance method set up, both for the in vitro assays, but also as our news showed, we have actually thought about what that actually means for human studies. Something that I think has been lost in the discussion currently about the analytical methods, that what you need as QA, QC for analytical methods differs by the use of that data. May that be hazard identification or quantitative risk assessment is something different, and we have to think about that a little bit more insightful than what has been done until now. As we said, we have been able to actually provide reference materials, and we have now tissue-ready protocols for the scientific community to be actually used so that this field can move forward. The second part that we actually highlighted in the CUSP report is around hazard assessment. And again, we have immediate, midterm, and long-term goals, where the immediate goals are really to see how we can set up novel test systems, how we can actually perhaps move to in silico techniques to understand those. It's also clear that we need a tiered approach to do so, and at the long term, that we really have to move to more complex exposures, as Juliette already pointed out, that is something that we have currently still as a gap. We also have to think about a more sensitive biological readouts, because I think the AURORA results show basically, if we think about acute toxicity, that on the standard parameters, we may actually see moderate or weak biological effects. But when we look deeper, we do see certain effects coming up, and that we need to understand better. That's where I think AURORA has made the difference by actually providing the tiered approach to actually look at placental toxicity and looking at more complex exposures. It's also important to point out that we do see in AURORA differences between the cell-free and cellular toxicity assays, and that's another area that we need to focus on more specifically. The third element that we had in the CUSP roadmap is about exposure assessment. You heard Renu talking extensively about what we have at the immediate, midterm, and long-term goals, that we need these reporting standards, we need these SOPs for doing exposure assessment. In the midterm, we said that when we have those, then we have to start understanding what the exposures are in the populations, what distributions are, what determinants are. At the long term, again, we need to scale to actually understand what the exposures are in the full population. What we did in Aurora is something I think was daring, and I think cost us, well, I already had gray hairs before we started, but I kept them. And that is that we did the first very large epidemiological study, and doing 800 samples or approaching 1,000 samples when you think about placenta material, when you think about cord blood, when you think about measuring the chemicals, that was a huge endeavor that we actually tried to push forward. I think it's fair to say that at this moment, it's very difficult to scale. We tried it, but it was a huge effort. If we really want to get good human data from real world evidence, we need to think really how we actually need to scale these methods to larger sample sets to really find the potential effects that might be there. I think the study from Amanda really showed very nicely that household exposures are important and can be quantified. And what really was a take-home message for me there is that when we look at repeated samples, that actually we see that it's stable over time, which means that there are consistent determinants that actually determine these exposures. And that's interesting because that gives us ideas about mitigation. The fourth element that came out of the CUSP roadmap was that we really need to get to risk assessment frameworks. We do have risk assessment frameworks when we think about chemicals. We do have them when we think about particles. But the essential question that we had, is that enough to actually also understand the risk of micro nanoplastics? That's where we said that we need to develop those, and that those in the immediate basically have to be able to do qualitative risk assessment of MNPs and their mixtures. That in the midterm, we basically need to load those more and more with hazard information and exposure information. I think Jarlath was completely right to say at this moment we have a framework that we build in Aurora that allows us to do that. But at this moment, we basically need to take it from a exposure point of view, because the hazard information, the risk information will come in later, but we are ready to actually absorb that. That's also the long-term goal that actually has been defined within CUSP. And I think what we have done in Aurora now is that we actually have produced the risk assessment framework that allows us actually to guide us through this process from the immediate to the long-term efforts that we need to do. It is completely transparent. It's completely open. So for anybody to actually use and criticize and update so that we actually move this field forward. The CUSP project was not about mitigation. The CUSP projects that we had, and also not Aurora, were more about understanding the hazard, about understanding exposure. We were not focusing on interventions and mitigations. However, in the CUSP roadmap, we really clearly identified that mitigation is an important aspect that we need to think about, and that's why we wrote a roadmap for mitigation, again, in the immediate, midterm, and long term. I think what Aurora has pointed out here, and what Jarlath also pointed out, is that we do already know something about the sources of micro and nanoplastics, and there are things that we can do as individuals, but there's also things that actually can be done on the policy end to try to mitigate those exposures. It's also true that the data from Aurora points out that we do see that there are real drivers of these micro nanoplastics within the population, but we don't always understand what exactly those determinants are. Me as an exposure assessor, that is a little bit troublesome, because if we don't know what those sources are and what these drivers are, mitigation becomes a little bit more difficult. And so I think one of the things that we really have to try to better understand is what are the sources that we have in the environments, and where are basically our action points that we actually can take. Aurora is actually providing that first evidence to actually be able to do that. I think the vulnerable population lens that Aurora took is important, because this is really where we can push the risk assessment framework. Jarlath is right to point out that what we build is also applicable to others. When I turn this basically to policy, I put it here as the 3 R's. I know that there are variants of 5 and 6 R's, but to me, basically, what we're talking here about is that based on the current knowledge that we have in Aurora, but also in others, that we really have to think about the reduced use of plastics. And so that is basically phasing out the non-essential plastic use, which is one of the European policies, but that can actually be driven further. It's also limiting migration of plastics at the source and so on. We also have to think about reuse, but when we think about reuse and recycle, those are really second and third to actually the first point and actually trying to reduce. Reuse we can do, but of course there are issues about reusing, and we really have to think about safe by design, how we actually can make safer plastics if they are there. When we think about recycling at this moment, we don't recycle much of the plastics that we actually get into the society. But what we really think about here is how we actually can close the loop here and think about who is responsible for these, and also avoid regrettable substitutions here. So we really have to think about what we need to do here. My point is basically we have to think more upstream than downstream. This is not about recycling. This is really about thinking about what plastics do we need? How much plastic do we need? Can we actually cap the plastic production?